Jairam Ramesh.
Thank you, sir. Sir, I rise to speak on the Taxation Laws Amendment Bill 2019. And I would make my comments in three parts. There's a subtext to this bill, there's the text of this bill, and there is the context of this bill. So I'm going to first talk about the subtext of the bill. So this bill really gives legislative sanction to an announcement made by the Honorable Finance Minister on the 20th of September 2019 during the course of a GST Council meeting in Goa. She had presented her maiden budget on the 5th of July 2019, but within 77 days, major changes were made to the corporate tax regime, and that too through a big bang announcement in Goa. So the changes were welcome, but the timing was quite extraordinary. 2 days later, there was the Howdy Modi event in Houston. Prime ministers always like to go on foreign trips accompanied by major policy announcements. And I think what happened on the 20th of September 2019 was a curtain raiser for the event that was to follow in Houston. Otherwise, after presenting a maiden budget on the 5th of July, within 77 days, the finance minister would not make such an announcement. Normally, the GST Council is a council in which items are discussed through a process of consensus, but this was a unilateral announcement, a bold announcement, an aggressive announcement, no doubt, but a unilateral announcement on the part of the finance minister. So let me now come to the text of the bill. The text of the bill is very simple. The finance minister has explained it repeatedly. The headline rate of corporate tax comes down from 30% to 22%. And for manufacturing companies who set up shop after the 1st of October 2019, the corporate tax rate is reduced to 15%. So when Mr. Arun Jaitley, the late Mr. Arun Jaitley, presented his budget in 2015-16, he announced a 4-year phased reduction program in the rate of corporate tax from 30 to 25%. And the finance minister's announcement in Goa, I take it, was in the tradition of what Mr. Jaitley had announced, but he had not followed through along the lines which he had perhaps anticipated when presenting the budget. So 30 headline rate comes down to 22 headline, and the manufacturing companies will attract a rate of tax of 15%. The Honorable Finance Minister is also on record as having said, if companies do not make use of any rebates or allowances, the rate of tax would be 25.17%. So this 25.17% is compared to what? You have a nominal rate of tax and you have an effective rate of tax. And in 2017-18, the effective rate of tax was slightly over 28.5%. So my question to the Honorable Finance Minister, 30 to 22 looks very grand, but 28.5 effective rate of taxation to 25.17 does not look all that grand as compared to what the announcement was made. So further, the finance minister also announced in Goa, and I compliment her for being fully transparent, that we will lose, the economy will lose about 1,45,000 crores on account of these corporate tax reductions. Now, so when you look at the structure of people who are paying the corporate tax, only about 850 odd companies are paying an effective rate of taxation of more than 30%. Only about 850 odd. And these companies account for about 16% of the total corporate tax collection. So this 1,45,000 crores, according to my calculations, will benefit largely 850 odd companies. But it's a very large benefit that we are giving, 1,45,000 crores, in the hope that capital expenditure will actually increase. Now, sir, when an ordinance is issued and a bill comes after the ordinance, usually the bill sanctifies the ordinance. But I wish to point out, sir, that there are significant differences between the ordinance that was issued following the finance minister's announcement and the bill that we are discussing today. There are three very significant differences. And most important difference between the ordinance and the bill is that the effective rate of MAT, the minimum alternative tax, was, according to the finance minister's initial announcement, to be made applicable from the financial year 2019-20, but according to the bill, it will be made applicable from the financial year 2021. So this, again, I do not want to make a big issue out of it, because obviously the finance minister will come back and say, but 10 years ago, this is what happened, 15 years ago, this is what happened. It's quite possible it may have happened. But sir, normally, members of parliament operate on the assumption that a bill issued after an ordinance converts the ordinance into a law. But I wish to point out that in this bill, there are three very significant differences between the ordinance, and one of the differences I have pointed out relates to the minimum alternative tax. Sir, no government should take parliament for granted. No government. And when an ordinance is issued, the bill must reflect the ordinance. If changes are made following the issue of the ordinance, it reflects poor staff work, poor homework on the part of the government in power. So I am not casting aspersions on anybody, but I do wish to say that normal parliamentary practice is 100% mirror image of the bill with the ordinance that is issued. So the corporate tax reduction involving a loss of, not a loss, but a revenue foregone of 1,45,000 crores is about 5% of the total revenue, slightly over 5% of the total revenue that the finance minister had budgeted for in her maiden budget of July 5th, 2019. The assumption here is that companies will have more cash. This cash will convert into increased capital expenditure, and this increased capital expenditure will fuel economic growth. Now, I come to the third part of my presentation. After the subtext and the text, I want to come to the context of this. So what is the context of the corporate tax reduction? The context of the corporate tax reduction is, from January to March 2018, sir, there used to be a very famous Hindi film called QSQT. Now, we are living in a new era of QSQT, not Qayamat se Qayamat tak, but quarter se quarter tak. So, let us look at QSQT. 8.1%, 8%, 7%, 6.6%, 5.8%, 5%, and the latest 4.5%. So I'm not a great believer in QSQT, by the way, because economies grow on long-term growth trends. But when you have 6 consecutive quarters of GDP decline, not a recession, Honorable Finance Minister, by classic economics textbook definitions, but 6 consecutive quarters of GDP decline, it is cause for worry. These are not statistical declines. These are not statistical aggregates. Look at it. To come from 8% to 4.5% requires extraordinary effort on the part of the government in power. And I wish to say that the government in power has worked very hard to achieve 6 consecutive quarters of GDP decline. Sir, we have had an extensive discussion on the state of the economy. The Honorable Finance Minister has responded equally extensively. But I do wish to make the point that the assumption governing this bill, that companies will have more cash, cash will lead to more capital expenditure, and capital expenditure will lead to more growth, is fundamentally flawed. Because what is lying at the root of the economic problem today is consumption. So India has faced economic crisis over the last 70 years. And every economic crisis can be traced to one of 5 Fs. This is the 5F theory of economic crisis. Food, fuel, foreign exchange, fiscal deficit, and financial crisis. These are the 5 Fs. Sir, I'm also learning from you how to alliterate and to make a dry subject like economics a little more interesting. So if you look from 1950, whenever India has had an economic crisis, we have had a shortage of foreign exchange, or we have had a failed monsoon, or we have had a ballooning fiscal deficit, or we have had increased oil prices, or we have had international financial crisis. This is the first economic crisis in India when macroeconomic variables look very healthy. India is sitting on $450 billion of foreign exchange reserves. Inflation, consumer price inflation is less than 5%. Inflation is low. Economic indicators of the macroeconomy, fiscal deficit, not very, very high as compared to what it used to be many years ago. So this is a remarkable situation, and I think we need to understand this. Food is not a problem, foreign exchange is not a problem, fiscal deficit doesn't seem to be that much of a problem, financial crisis is certainly not a problem, foreign exchange is not a problem. So what is the problem? Why is the economy so healthy on the one side and showing decline quarter after quarter after quarter for 6 quarters? So I request the finance minister, economics textbooks do not teach us anything for this situation that India finds itself in. Most countries in crisis have no foreign exchange. Most countries in crisis have problems with their fiscal deficit. Most countries in crisis face ballooning inflation. We are not in that situation. But yet, our situation is one of continuous economic deceleration. And I come back to the point, sir, sentiment. Sentiment is subdued. Sentiment is negative. Sentiment is not positive. This corporate tax reduction helped markets balloon 24 hours, 48 hours, but did nothing to address long-term issues of sentiment, long-term issues of consumption, long-term issues of investment sluggishness. So I request the Honorable Finance Minister, she will get this bill passed. Corporate India has welcomed this bill. Any reduction in tax rates today, sir, is welcomed by everybody. That's the new fiscal sociology that we have. We used to have a finance minister in the 50s, the great T.T. Krishnamachari, TTK, who used to present budgets. And every time he presented a budget, a member would get up and say, TTK stands for tax, tax and kill. But that tax, tax and kill era is over. Now it is reduce tax, reduce tax and reduce tax. But I wish to suggest to you that this corporate tax reduction is good atmospherics, good headlines, good PR, but is not going to address the structural problems of the economy that is born out of falling consumption and declining investment. So with these words, sir, I wish to extend my support to the amendments with a request that the finance minister in future, when she comes with ordinances, does not make changes after the ordinance is issued, brings a bill in consonance with the ordinance, and as far as possible, avoid major economic policy pronouncements via the ordinance route. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Ramesh ji.